Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving right in to strip away the myth and reconstruct a completely grounded, psychological case study of one of the ancient Near East's most haunting events. We're talking about the story of Lot's wife. Usually, we hear this tale entirely through the lens of fire, brimstone, and, spectacular divine judgment. But if we look closely at the source material, wow, what we actually find is a silent, deeply haunting, and profoundly human tragedy. It's quite literally the ultimate warning against the absolute dangers of divided spiritual loyalty.
So we're opening with the stark reality of a woman who miraculously survived an apocalypse, only to be turned to stone by her own divided heart. Genesis chapter 19, verse 26 captures this exact moment in one single, absolutely devastating sentence. She isn't wiped out by the falling fire or the brimstone raining down on the cities. No, she's destroyed by a choice. We are looking at the ultimate archetype of someone who hesitates at the very threshold of a completely new life, all because their heart remains tethered to the exact things that are destroying them.
Section 1. The Unnamed Woman of Sodom.
Okay, let's play detective for a second and examine who this nameless woman actually was. Why doesn't the text give her a name? Usually God names the wives of the patriarchs, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Leah, and gives us their backgrounds. But here, her identity is totally withheld. To figure out why she's presented as this tragic archetype, we've got to start with the fact that her husband, Lot, arrived in this region completely unmarried. If we track Lot's journey, we see he left Haran with his uncle Abraham without a wife. Even later, when Lot and Abraham get so wealthy that their massive flocks literally force them to separate, there's still zero mention of a wife. It's only after Lot pitches his tent as far as Sodom and settles among the cities of the valley that she suddenly enters the picture. These historical breadcrumbs strongly suggest she was a native of Sodom. She was a woman whose entire identity, social status, and luxurious comfort were completely anchored to this doomed city. For her, Sodom wasn't just some hub of wickedness, it was home.
Now, what's truly staggering to me is the sheer volume of divine intervention she experienced. She wasn't just some random bystander caught in the crossfire. Years prior, when Sodom was defeated in battle and she was taken captive, she was rescued by Abraham's forces. Then, right on the eve of the destruction, she's personally hosting divine messengers in her own home. In the dead of night, she watches those exact same angels blind a violent mob trying to break down her front door. And finally, at the break of dawn, she is physically escorted out of the blazing fire. She was repeatedly shown immense life-saving grace, which makes her ultimate fate feel, incredibly tragic. She essentially threw all that grace away by her final action.
Section 2. The Architecture of Attachment.
To really grasp the gravity of her hesitation, we have to understand the environment that had become her reality. We need to look at the architecture of her attachment. You see, the angels weren't just pulling her out of a burning city. They were stripping away the only social fabric and future she knew. Imagine the psychological fracture she was going through. She had raised her children there, she built a highly comfortable life, perfectly surrounded by a society she had fully integrated into. When the command came to flee, she wasn't just packing her bags. She was being asked to abandon her entire sense of self at the command of a God whose ways must have felt completely terrifying and abrupt to her.
So, the crucial point here is how agonizingly close she was to salvation. Just think about her situation. She had already made it out of the city gates. The destruction was literally behind her. Her husband and her kids were right there securely at her side. Absolute safety and a fresh start with a righteous man were just steps ahead of her. She was standing right on the very threshold of deliverance. You could almost call her completely saved in that exact moment, right before she threw the whole shebang away. She perished with the world simply because she couldn't detach her soul from its ashes.
Section 3. The Anatomy of a Glance.
And that brings us to the inciting incident of her demise, that simple, absolute command not to look back, and the profound theology hidden right inside that single action. When we read that she looked back, we usually picture, a sudden reflex or a quick accidental glance over the shoulder. But the Hebrew root word used here, nabat, tells a totally different story. It means to scan, to look intently at, to regard with pleasure or favor. Her action wasn't a flinch. It was a deeply emotional, intentional choice to re-engage with the life she was losing. It was a look of intense longing. It was the physical manifestation of a heart that flat out refused to sever its ties with a world God had condemned.
And the consequence of that longing was poetic, chilling justice.
By becoming a pillar of salt, she was permanently encased in the very substance of divine judgment. Sure, in the ancient world, salt could be a preservative, but in the context of biblical judgment, like what we see later in Deuteronomy chapter 29, it represents scorched earth, absolute sterility, and barrenness. It's an environment where life can simply no longer take root. She refused to move forward, so she was permanently halted right there. She literally became a sterile monument to the fatal cost of lingering.
Section 4. The Theology of Boundaries.
This specific event actually builds into a recurring structural anchor we find throughout the biblical text. God frequently uses what we can call the single boundary as a diagnostic tool for the human heart. Think about it. Both Eve and Lot's wife were tested by this exact kind of boundary. For Eve in the garden, the solitary prohibition was simply do not eat. Her transgression was born of intellectual deception. She actively chose to believe a lie about God's character. For Lot's wife, the prohibition was a single, straightforward direction in a collapsing world. Do not look back. Her transgression was emotional attachment. Her heart was just completely native to the city she was fleeing. The test is never really about the restriction itself, is it? It is always about the internal orientation of the soul.
This perfectly reveals what we call the for your own good principle. Listen, God wasn't arbitrarily limiting her freedom. He was setting up a protective perimeter to insulate her from her own self-destruction. God was effectively saying, hey, I am keeping you away from the edge of the cliff. But she, much like Eve, thought she knew better. They both falsely believed they could preserve their identity or become complete by reaching for the very thing God had forbidden. And in doing so, they lost absolutely everything. It really goes to show us that loyalty to God is most clearly proven in our obedience to the boundaries we might think are small or insignificant.
Section 5. The warning in the salt.
Now, this psychological fracture from the ancient world isn't just some dusty historical footnote. No way. It holds an urgent, direct implication for anyone examining their own spiritual journey today. Centuries later, Jesus intentionally drags this story right back to the forefront. In the Gospel of Luke, he elevates her demise to an urgent spiritual imperative, telling his followers, remember Lot's wife. He uses her as the ultimate warning against the idolatry of comfort and half-hearted salvation. Jesus is basically saying that when the time comes to flee judgment, you absolutely cannot try to secure the material things your old life was made up of, because if you try to save that old life, you're going to lose it all.
Her tragic legacy teaches us that true salvation is an active process of severing. It demands the painful, intentional killing of our old attachments. Divided spiritual loyalty simply does not work. When God provides an escape route, He demands total, unwavering commitment to the destination. To look back, to Nabat, to gaze with that intense longing, it just proves that the heart still permanently resides in the place of death. You literally cannot simultaneously cherish the world you are being saved from while clinging to the God who is saving you.
So I want to leave you with this haunting question to consider as we wrap up this explainer. Are you truly, fully leaving your old world behind? Or are you just physically walking away while your heart remains glued to the ashes of your old life? Because let's be honest, the most dangerous place you can ever stand is right at the border of your old self. Ultimately, we are either citizens of the kingdom moving firmly forward, or we are permanent, frozen monuments to the world we refuse to forsake. Something to think about.